Hello everyone, it's Michelle Lupton here, and I'm making this video today because I've had lots of requests for videos. Lots of my cards that I post on Instagram and on my blog, people keep asking, have you made a video of this one? Have you made a video of that one? And they all tend to be cards that I've used either alcohol inks or alcohol pearls on. So today I'm making 3 cards with this rainbow of alcohol pearls. Now, the thing to remember about alcohol pearls is you have to mix them up to start with because they have the sort of shimmery powder in them, and you have to make sure that's suspended. I'm also using the blending solution, and also my little Tim Holtz Distress spritzer tool. So I always start with Yupo, and so that's a sort of a plastic paper, and it's very, very smooth. So I start with the blending solution wherever I want this ink to move to, and I quite like the look of alcohol inks and alcohol pearls where there's a fair bit of transparency to the colour, but there's also a bit of texture to the colour. So I start by just adding a very small amount of ink. I don't even squeeze the bottle very much at all. I'm not getting sort of huge big drops of ink out at each time, and I'm dragging the bottle across the Yupo, so the tip of the bottle is actually touching the Yupo. And that gives a fairly small amount of ink onto the Yupo, and then I move it around using the spritzer tool, and sort of little puffs of air. Now you can just use a straw to do this, but I find this tool a whole lot easier. And now I just go in with either more ink in areas that I think need a little bit more texture or a little bit more depth of colour, or I go back in with more blending solution where I think it's a little bit too intense and I want to spread the colour out. So I find that some colours I tend to add more of, and other colours I tend to spread out a bit more with the blending solution. So I generally tend to want to spread the red out more, and I always tend to add more of the blues, but that's just me because I love the blues. Now, I hope you could see the shine on that. It's just beautiful. I'm just cleaning up some of the alcohol pearls that got onto my craft mat here. I just used some isopropyl alcohol, just some rubbing alcohol that I've got in a little spray bottle. Okay, so I'm actually making 3 cards today, and all with the same set of alcohol pearls, but with different arrangements of the rainbow on the cards. So this one, I just wanted a circle of the alcohol pearls. Now, the trap with this is that when you do a rainbow from one side of the card to the other, you get red blending into orange, blending into yellow, and it's all very beautiful. But when you do it in a circle, you end up with this muddy patch in the middle. So where, for example, you get the red and the green and the orange meeting, or where you get the purple and the orange and the yellow meeting, or whatever in the middle, you get this brown sort of colour. So it's tricky to try and avoid that, but what I tend to do is when I make cards with this arrangement, I just plan to have something covering that up on the card at the end, so it's not as noticeable. Now, right now, I got a little bit of a splash of red just up the top, so I'm just trying to remove most of that with, again, the rubbing alcohol. But it didn't completely go. So Yupo quite often stains, so you can remove the ink to a certain extent, but you can't remove it completely from the Yupo. Now, with this particular card, I personally think I went a little bit overboard. I should have stopped, but there were some areas that were just a little bit too flat. There wasn't enough texture to them for my liking. So I went back in with more colour, and personally, I just think it was just a little bit too much, especially in the area with the red and the purple here. Now, it was quite flat, but yeah, I just should have not added so much colour. Anyway, a lot of that's going to be covered up anyway with the sentiment that I'm going to put on the middle of this card. And also another thing that I'm going to be doing this card, and actually two of the cards that I'm doing in the video today, what I'm going to be doing is embossing over the top of these alcohol pearls. Now, it's not an easy technique to do, because if you keep your heat tool on one particular area too long, the Yupo will warp, and it'll warp seriously. Now, in the two cards that I did do embossing on, both of them, the Yupo actually did warp, but it wasn't irretrievable. So you just got to make sure you use lots of adhesive and make sure it's stuck down to the card well. Now, this one I decided to do a diagonal pattern, and this one I intentionally used less colour, less of the ink, and spread it out so I got more of a translucent look to the ink going across this one. Just because the last one I thought I added too much of the colour, I was a little bit more careful with this one. I still did go back and add a little bit more here and there, but not too much. I quite like the look around the edges of the colour where it sort of fades out and you get a very see-through effect. But I also do like the areas where you get a little bit of texture where some of the ink is a bit thicker than other areas. Also, when you use alcohol inks and you get this texture, it's very useful if you want to add foil over the top of it, because the foil tends to stick to the areas where there's a little bit more ink and it's a bit thicker. Now, I haven't used any foil on today's cards, but I do quite often enjoy adding especially gold foil to alcohol ink backgrounds. All right, so that's my 3 rainbows done. And I'm just going to show you the card making process for one of these. So for this one, I used a stamp from W+9. I just love this floral image. I use it a lot. On one of the other cards, I used the same technique of stamping over the alcohol pearls with Versamark ink, and then adding white embossing powder. The other card I used a stamp from Sweet and Sassy Stamps. It's a very large flower stamp, which I really love. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding lots of the anti-static powder tool from EK Success to make sure that my embossing powder only sticks where I want it to stick, which is where the ink is going to go. However, when you do embossing over Yupo, you do get a lot of static, and regardless of whether you've used the embossing tool or not, I find. So you really have to make sure you flick off the excess embossing powder. Now, I'm just pushing really firmly here because I have found that the Yupo, you can see it right now, it really pulls up, it sticks quite a lot to the Versamark ink and to your stamp, so it sort of pulls up out of the misty. So I try and make sure I get it all done in one hit. So you can see here lots and lots of embossing powder. I have to tap it off really, really well. I missed a bit there, so I'm adding a bit more. So I'm just making sure that I have actually got all of that covered with this embossing powder. I'm using Hero Art's white embossing powder, which is my favourite. And now comes the tricky bit. I'm going to apply my heat tool. Now, this technique, you have to be really, really careful. What I've found is a few things. First of all, you need to make sure your heat tool is good and warmed up. So you can see me just holding it here while it's on. And keep it moving. Never leave it on one spot for very long at all. Now you can see I've sped this up, and I've also cut out a fair bit of time here because it does take a fair amount of time to actually get this all embossed. And you can see that this has actually warped a little bit. The bottom left hand corner was a little bit curled up, but I also find that if you add plenty of adhesive on the back, it usually stays stuck quite well to a card base, as long as you're actually using a fairly heavyweight card base. So this card base is 110 pound Nina Solar White. I tend to like 110 pound cardstock for my card bases. Now for the sentiment for this one, and for also one of my other cards that I'm going to show you, I used a sentiment from this beautiful stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. I really love the mixture of fonts in these sentiments. And I don't know what it was with me today. I was just dropsy. I kept dropping the stamp. So you can see up in the top of this bit of black cardstock, there's a mistake that I did earlier on one of the other cards, because I stamped it and then immediately dropped a stamp on top of where I'd stamped it. And I just did it again. So, yeah, my hands weren't cooperating with me today. Anyway, one of my favourite things to do with rainbow cards is to keep the sentiment with lots of contrast with it. So I tend to use black sentiments, or in this case a white embossed sentiment on black. But I also like sort of fussy cutting around the sentiment, one, so it doesn't cover up very much of the rainbow, because that's the whole point of the card, is to have the rainbow, but also to give a bit of interest to the card. So this one, I've got the sentiment from Simon Says Stamp, and the floral stamp is from W+9. Second card I've got, which I'm going to show you in just a tick, the floral stamp was from Sweet and Sassy, and the sentiment also from Simon Says Stamp. The third one just has a sentiment from Hero Arts, unfortunately from a discontinued set. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you got some tips about embossing on Yupo and using alcohol pearls. Thanks!